Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar on effective information lifecycle management and protection with Microsoft 365. I'm Jason Lee. I'm the technical lead for collaboration and content at Chorus. We're Microsoft's Gold partner in the UK. So what's the connection between information lifecycle management and information protection? Essentially, they're both tools for managing data risk. So today, we'll start by just setting out the scope and our assumptions. We'll talk about the issue, problem we're trying to solve. We'll look at managing lifecycle based on the content of the information. We'll look at managing lifecycles of groups. We'll look at protecting content based on its sensitivity. And then we'll dig a bit deeper into discovery and automation and how you can design your Microsoft 365 structures for effective information management. So the focus today is very much going to be on managing unstructured information. So that's your files, your emails, your persistent chat in Teams and so on. We're assuming that you're already or you're at least moving towards managing your files in Microsoft 365, whether that's SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, or indirectly through Teams. You may also have some legacy file shares or some other cloud storage locations, and you're looking to improve consistency, improve the way you approach information governance and protection across all of your repositories. So, understanding the issue, what are the challenges we're looking at here? We've got exponentially increasing volumes of unstructured data. We've got stricter regulatory requirements, so GDPR, HIPAA, PCI DSS, CCPA, and so on. We've got changes to working practices, so people are increasingly accessing data from multiple devices, personal devices, multiple locations, and we've got decentralization of data storage. So we're no longer keeping everything in one place behind a firewall. You might be hybrid cloud, you might have some cloud storage, some on-premise data storage, and so on. As a result of all this, managing data risk is harder than ever. So how do we approach it? So first of all, we've got to understand what type of content we're storing. So we need to understand both what it is and what our obligations are when it comes to managing it. We need to classify that information so that you can apply appropriate controls. We need to preserve it while you need to keep it, while you're obliged to keep it, protect it at the same time based on how sensitive it is, and dispose of it when it's no longer required or when we're obliged to get rid of it. And that last one is really key. So the best way to minimize the risk that a piece of information is going to fall into the wrong hands is to delete it when you no longer need it. So in other words, the age of aiming to keep everything forever is hopefully well and truly over. We're not going to cover these in a completely linear order. So the first one, the understanding and discovery element, will make a lot more sense once we've covered classification and protection, so we know what kind of framework we're operating in. So what does data classification look like in Microsoft 365? There's really two elements to it. The first is classifying for information sensitivity. So this is usually driven by an information classification policy or a data handling policy. And the reason for doing it is to apply protection or to apply handling restrictions based on that sensitivity. So usually you end up with somewhere between 2 and 5 discrete categories, kind of buckets that all your content is going to fit into, and they're independent of the functional area or business purpose. So they're things like public, general, confidential, highly confidential. It doesn't matter whether it's a statement of work, an invoice. All we care about is how sensitive is it. The primary tool for this kind of classification is sensitivity labels. which is part of a solution called Microsoft Information Protection. The second angle on data classification is classifying for lifecycle management. So this is usually driven by a file plan or a data governance plan, and we're aiming to classify content based on its business purpose. So what is it? Is it a statement of work? Is it an NDA? Is it a complaint? Is it a consent form? Is it a cost assessment, a risk assessment, and so on? And we're using that classification to drive lifecycle management and records management. And the primary tool there is retention labels, which is part of Microsoft Information Governance. So a lot of people wonder why we need two different classification schemes, two different labeling schemes. And it's really because some types of content can have a range of sensitivities. So think of it as a two-dimensional grid. If we've got, take an NDA, for example, NDAs could cover a whole range of sensitivities. So you could have everything from your standard agreement that your suppliers sign up to, right up to a damage limitation settlement that could be highly sensitive. So there's not that one-to-one mapping. We can't say all statement of works are going to be restricted, all NDAs are going to be confidential. It's unfortunately not usually as simple as that. So let's look first at lifecycle management based on content, so using our retention labels. So the goal here is basically to ensure that we're storing all our information in line with requirements, and those requirements can be legal or regulatory or unique to your business. So we need to protect information from deletion while we need it, while we're obliged to keep it. We may need to preserve information to meet record keeping requirements to make sure it can't be changed. We need to remove information when we're obliged to, when we no longer need it. And we may need to provide proof of deletion as well. So some regulatory requirements will actually require you to prove that you have deleted certain types of content. So the tools we're looking at here, there are two Microsoft 365 compliance solutions. One is information governance and the other is records management. So both of these use retention labels. Records management is just a little bit more robust, aimed at very formal scenarios where you need to demonstrate certain record keeping requirements. These solutions give us classification and governance across SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange mailboxes, and a range of third-party data as well through an import and archive process. And it supports both manual and automated classification. It's worth just noting at this point that if you're covering SharePoint, OneDrive, and Exchange, you've got Microsoft 365 pretty much covered for information management. So anything that builds on a Microsoft 365 group, so Microsoft Teams, Yammer communities, Planner plans, Outlook groups, and so on, they're all leveraging SharePoint for file management. They're all leveraging Exchange for communications compliance. So by covering those core platforms, you've basically got Microsoft 365 wrapped up. So retention labels. We apply them to files and to emails for various reasons. Could be pure classification, just to indicate the business purpose of that piece of content. It could be to retain it for a specified period, preserve it as a record, delete it or review it after a specified period, or do a combination of both. So protect it for a certain period and then delete it automatically at the end of that period. Creating these things is very, very straightforward. So it's basically a two-step process. So you give it a name and a description, and you choose what you want it to do. So how you want it to retain or expire items, and how you want it to trigger. So you can trigger these retention periods based on when an item was created, when it was last modified, when it was labeled, or some more sophisticated scenarios such as event-driven retention, which we'll take a quick look at. Once you've created your labels, you either publish them or you create a policy to automatically apply them. So let's look at publishing first. The idea of publishing labels is you want to make a relevant subset of your labels available at relevant locations. So bearing in mind, if you've got a big file plan, you might have 40 or 50 content types overall. You might have that many labels. You're not going to want 50 labels for people to choose from on every SharePoint site, every mailbox, every OneDrive. So instead, you're using these publishing policies to target relevant labels to relevant places. So for example, we might select a collection of HR related labels, and we use a label policy to make those labels available on the Outlook mailboxes of the HR team, their HR records SharePoint site, their recruitment team, and their OneDrive locations. Once you've published your labels to location, users or admins can set defaults on SharePoint document libraries, also on Outlook mailbox folders. And that can be quite a useful thing to do. So if you imagine you're a member of an HR team and you're receiving job applications, you might want to make sure that those job applications, those CVs, resumes you've received, get deleted automatically after 12 months. So if you create a subfolder in your Outlook mailbox and you set a default label on that subfolder, drag your job applications into that folder, they'll be managed automatically. So they'll be kept for 12 months and then deleted at the end of that period. So it can be quite a useful capability. The other approach is to apply your retention labels automatically. So this is obviously much easier from the user's perspective, but it does take more setting up. It does actually require a high level of licensing as well, which we can talk about later. You can apply your retention labels based on various things. So it could be if the content contains specific words or phrases. Could be if it was authored by a particular person or has a particular email subject keyword. Or it could use some more sophisticated approaches that we'll look at later, like sensitive information types and trainable classifiers. So a couple of more sophisticated retention capabilities, just to look at very briefly. Deleting content automatically after a certain period of time, it's very useful, it's very low maintenance, but it might not be nuanced enough for every scenario. So you do have an alternative, and that's a disposition review. So the way this works is you apply your label, let's say it's a 7-year retention. When you reach the end of that 7-year retention, a reviewer gets notified, and then the reviewer has various options, and you can see them in the screenshot here. You can choose to approve the disposal, so go ahead and get rid of that piece of content. You can extend the retention. You can remove the label, apply a different label. So you've basically got a full set of choices as to how you deal with that content. So another more sophisticated approach would be event-driven retention. So the usual scenario for this one, the usual example is something like HR content. So let's say you're storing HR content, could be in various places, could be hopefully it's in your SharePoint site, could be in OneDrive, it could be in emails. What you want to happen typically with HR content is you retain it indefinitely while that person is working for you, and then you're obliged to delete it after a specified period when that person leaves. So you might keep it indefinitely while they're with you, delete it automatically 12 months, 3 years, whatever it is, after they've left your organization. So to do that, when you apply the label, you specify an asset ID, and that asset ID in this example will be something like an employee number. When that employee leaves, you trigger the event, and you trigger the event so that any labels with that matching asset ID are activated. So you're basically activating that time bomb. You're activating those labels so that person's left, the clock starts ticking, that retention and expiration period is now active. Very briefly, you can use retention labels to mark items as records. This is something you typically do when you need to ensure that an item is preserved and not modified. SharePoint and OneDrive do allow record versioning as well. So if it's a specific version of a file that you need to preserve for records keeping purposes, you can do that. At the end of that records management period, you've got proof of deletion as well. And finally, we've got file plans, which is just a more sophisticated way of managing labels and classifications. If you're doing this on a grand scale or you're highly regulating your storage environment, you need something like this. This allows you to build your file plan as a paper exercise, import it as a CSV, and drive label creation automatically from that. The other side to lifecycle management is group-based lifecycle management. So you may or may not be familiar with Microsoft 365 groups. I know they can be quite confusing to a lot of people. Basically, every kind of collaboration space that you create in Microsoft 365 builds on a Microsoft 365 group. So if you're creating a team in Microsoft Teams, a SharePoint team site, an Outlook group, a Yammer community, a stream group, a planner plan, a Power BI workspace, all of these things build on top of Microsoft 365 groups. Your Microsoft 365 group is essentially a specialized type of security group. It lives in Azure AD, and it allows you to map a group of people to a set of Microsoft 365 resources. So just a quick example of how that works. If we look at Teams, Teams itself, a team in Teams is really just a thin wrapper around a Microsoft 365 group. So when you create a team, you're actually creating a Microsoft 365 group, and your team membership is the membership of that underlying group. And then through that group, the team membership is mapped into a SharePoint workspace, an Exchange group mailbox, and anything else you're associating with that team. So it could be stream videos, it could be a planner plan, and so on. So the group is really at the heart of this. The group is what manages access and collects all of these resources together. So when you're using Teams, you're actually using an underlying SharePoint site, an underlying mailbox, and that whole process is made seamless through that Microsoft 365 group integration. And the reason why that's important is because you can use the group, you can target the group to apply your governance and to manage life cycle of information. So targeting a group with information lifecycle management means it doesn't matter what type of group it is, doesn't matter whether it's created as a team or an Outlook group or a planner plan and so on. Deleting that group deletes everything associated with that workspace. So the underlying SharePoint site, which is your file storage, the underlying group mailbox, which is your team email or your persistent chat, any other assets tied to the group. So you can basically manage the life cycle of all of that related information in one unit. And there's a very handy tool for doing that, and that is group expiration policies. So this allows you to specify a default lifetime for your Microsoft 365 groups. So let's say you set a default lifetime of 365 days. When an owner creates something that builds on a Microsoft 365 group, so let's say you create a team, when that anniversary approaches, when that 365 days is getting close, if the group is active, if the team is active, it will be automatically renewed. If it's dormant, So if no one's using it, no one's reading those files, no one's viewing the messages, the owner will start getting prompts, and they get prompts 30 days, 15 days, and 1 day prior to that expiration date. The prompt gives them the option to renew. If they don't, the group will be deleted. It's a very handy way of managing those groups, because what tends to happen with things like teams is lots of teams get created. Most of them will eventually fall dormant, and people will coalesce around probably 20% of those teams. So 20-25% of teams will get genuine momentum behind them. And this is just a way of automatically cleaning up those teams that fall dormant, so they're not forgotten, so you're not storing information that you're forgetting about. And the best analogy I heard for this, and I thank Lisa for this one, it's kind of natural selection for groups and teams. You have also got the ability to monitor groups, which is useful for watching dormancy and proliferation. So the screenshot you can see here is from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and you see our list of groups, and we can see when they were last active, so when people were last viewing files or actively participating, and we can also see which of the workloads it's storing information in. So that can give you some insight. This is also one of those areas where third-party governance tools can add a bit more insight if you need it. So if you need to track things like orphaned groups where a team no longer has an active owner, these kind of tools can add some insight there. Okay, so moving on to protecting content based on sensitivity. So the key idea here is that we're not treating all of our content the same. So there's always a trade-off when you're protecting information between making it as secure and tightly managed as possible without hampering productivity. And the solution is really not to treat all information the same. So you apply protection based on how sensitive that content is. So if you've got some content that's, say, low sensitivity, there's no reason why you shouldn't allow users to take it offline, work on it locally, access it on personal devices, share content with guests where it's appropriate to do so, and that's going to allow them to be as productive as possible. As the sensitivity of that information increases, you're probably going to want to look at restricting guest access. You might also want to restrict external sharing on that underlying SharePoint site. And you'll probably want to audit memberships, look at who's got access to what on a regular basis. And then when we get to high sensitivity, this is the point where you're probably going to want to look at encrypting your files, applying rights management. So even if a file is downloaded, emailed, uploaded to Google Drive, that protection travels with it. You probably want to look at blocking access to sites and teams from unmanaged devices. And you might also limit access so that users can only access that sensitive information where they're in specific physical places. So the tools here fall into the information protection solution in Microsoft 365 Compliance. And the core building block is sensitivity labels. And these allow us to do various things. So they allow us to classify and protect files and emails, also classify and protect containers like SharePoint sites and Teams and other Microsoft 365 groups. And we can also classify and protect across other data stores, on-premise data stores, other cloud platforms through AIP integration. So if we apply sensitivity labels to files, we can do various things. We can apply headers and footers, we can watermark the files, we can encrypt the files, restrict access, and we can apply rights management if we want to as well. So stop people printing, stop people forwarding, and so on. If we apply sensitivity labels to sites and teams, we're basically managing what people can do with those sites and teams. So it's kind of classification with teeth for sites and teams. The example here, you can see if I'm creating a new team, the very first thing I'm prompted for is a sensitivity. And if I choose highly confidential in this example, I'm immediately restricted as to what I can do. I can only create a private team. And you can see if I try and add an external user as a member, it stops me doing that as well. So we can do various things. We can manage those privacy options. We can control external sharing options, manage accessibility from unmanaged devices. And it also gives us a visual indication of sensitivity as well. So everyone who's looking at that team sees a label in the top right that says, hey, this is highly confidential. Just like retention labels, they're pretty straightforward to create. So we start with a name and description. We choose where you want it to be used. So whether it's for files and emails, whether it's for groups and sites, or whether it's for Azure Purview, which we'll touch on later. And then we choose what type of protection we want to apply. So for files and emails, it might be encryption settings. And for groups and sites, it might be managing access, controlling external sharing. Once we created them, we can publish them, or we can set them up with some auto labeling. So publishing, we create a label policy. The idea here is that we're targeting specific users with specific labels. So there's kind of a key difference between retention labels and sensitivity labels here. Our retention labels, we were targeting locations. So we were targeting specific SharePoint sites, specific OneDrives, specific mailboxes. With sensitivity labels, we're targeting users. And the idea here is that labels are universal for that user. So if a label is relevant to you, that label should be available for you to use everywhere you're working, whether you're in your email, on a SharePoint site, in Teams, in your OneDrive, and so on. So it's very much targeted at the user. When it comes to applying sensitivity labels automatically, you've got a couple of options here. So client-side labeling works almost in real time as users are working in Outlook or in the Office client apps or in Office Online. And you can basically recommend a label or apply a label automatically based on what that user is doing. So we're pattern matching, we're looking for sensitive information, and we're either automatically labeling that content or recommending that the user applies a label. And the other side of it is service side labeling. So this is again based on pattern matching, but it runs in the background and it runs against content stored in SharePoint and OneDrive. And it can also tackle emails coming and going through Exchange. So this gives you labeling at scale. So this is what it looks like if you're labeling client side. So you can see here, I might be working in Word or about to send an email, and I've dropped in a credit card number. And the sensitive information type here is looking for a specific checksum on that credit card number, so we can be highly confident that is a real credit card number. And we got some supporting evidence as well, because it's followed by an expiry date. And in this case, we're making that recommendation. So you can see the policy tip pop up. We're saying, hey, it looks like this is sensitive information. We recommend that you change the sensitivity of this document. On the service side, we do this through policy. So in this example, we've got a policy that's trawling our content, and it's looking for any content that's covered by GDPR. So we're looking at every Exchange mailbox, a specific SharePoint site, a specific OneDrive account. Any matching content will be automatically applied. Everything gets the same labels. In this case, we've got a confidential, personally identifiable information label. Anything that matches is going to be labeled with that label and protected. It's not universal, not at the moment anyway. So you can have a maximum of 10 policies, And each of those policies can target up to 10 specific SharePoint sites or OneDrives. So it is designed to be targeted. It's not designed to be kind of go away and scan all of my SharePoint sites, all of my OneDrives, and label everything automatically. It's a bit more targeted than that. You've got the ability to run these policies in simulation mode first to help ensure that you're labeling things correctly. And obviously, if you're encrypting files, that's quite important. You don't want to be doing that unless you're pretty certain that it does need to be protected in that way. Just to briefly touch on sublabels, just to give you an idea of how this typically works in practice. Every sensitivity label can have sublabels. And the way we usually use this is our top level labels reflect our classification scheme. So in this case, you've probably got an information protection policy that says all of our business information should fall into 4 categories: non-business, general, confidential, or highly confidential. But within those categories, there's almost certainly nuances in what kind of protection you need to apply. So for example, under confidential, we might have one sublabel for finance information that restricts visibility of that information to members of the finance team. We might have another for personally identifiable information that restricts access to that information to the HR team. And then wherever those files go, it doesn't matter where they're copied, where they're uploaded, those restrictions will always apply. You will need to prove your identity, verify you're a member of the finance team in order to view that file. The classification that you get through sensitivity labels is really quite joined up. It's integrated with Azure Information Protection. So you may hear the term MIP labels or unified labels as alternatives to sensitivity labels. And what that basically means is you're using the same set of labels across Microsoft 365 and Azure Information Protection. It does require just an initial migration of any legacy labels you've got in Azure Information Protection, but the idea is that your labels in Microsoft 365 become the master, and you can use them in a whole bunch of other places because they're replicated to AIP. So M365 labeling gives you that native support in your client apps for labeling protection. AIP gives you that extensibility to file system, to third-party integrations. And you can extend the reach of these labels in various ways. So for example, Azure Purview allows you to extend labeling to files in Azure Blob Storage. So if you're storing files in Azure Blob Storage as well as in M365, you can have the same set of sensitivity labels applied. You can also label data in database columns. Azure Purview, just briefly, is a data catalog. The idea is you connect it up to all your data sources, all your databases, and you have that sort of unified, holistic view of all your data in your organization. MCAS, Microsoft Cloud App Security, also opens up a whole bunch of other opportunities. So it gives you some more sophisticated capabilities for automatic labeling in SharePoint and OneDrive. It also allows you to extend sensitivity labels to files on Box and Dropbox as well. And then finally, the AIP Unified Labeling Scanner. This is about making your sensitivity labels available on premises. So if you've got on-prem file shares, or you've got legacy SharePoint environments, SharePoint 2013 onwards, you can apply those labels to those locations as well. Okay, so let's look briefly at what we can do in terms of discovery and automation. What are the tools there? So we'll look at 3 things. We'll look at sensitive info types in a bit more detail. We'll look at trainable classifiers, and we'll look at reporting. So the idea of sensitive information types we're identifying sensitive content based on pattern matching. And Microsoft provides currently 206 of these sensitive information types for well-known types of information. So this is things like passport numbers, national ID numbers, tax numbers, bank account numbers, information that follows a predictable format and pattern. It's expanding very rapidly. So the last time I ran a webinar that touched on sensitive information types, I think Microsoft were providing about 150. That was last October. We're now up to 206. You can also define your own. So you're looking in this case for patterns and word combinations that are unique to your organization. And it's based on confidence-based matching. So we start with words or phrases. So in this case, we're looking for the phrase Project Bermuda anywhere in our mailboxes, our SharePoint sites, our OneDrives. And we're looking for some supporting evidence to go with that as well. So within 300 characters, we want to see the words disappear or vanish or unexplained or triangle. Any of those supporting elements increase the confidence of the match. And then when we're setting up policies, when we're setting up automatic matching based on these sensitive information types, we can specify that confidence level and use it to tune the matching, basically to kind of optimize the balance between false positives and false negatives. So other examples of custom sensitive information types, it could be things like the format for your employee numbers. You can also create sensitive information types using EDM, or exact data match classification. So this is where you index your databases, where you're storing sensitive records, you connect it up to MIP, and then if that data does show up in your unstructured content, you know it's sensitive and you can easily label it accordingly. And just to give you an idea of how, I guess, fundamental sensitive information types are to these capabilities, you can see here how they're central to lots of different things in Microsoft compliance and protection. So we can use sensitive information types to automatically apply retention labels. We can use them to automatically apply sensitivity labels. And we can also use them to drive data loss prevention policies, which we're not going to cover today, but which is another one of those foundational areas of kind of compliance and governance in Microsoft 365. So trainable classifiers, where sensitive information types are good is where you've got some very predictable, specific patterns in data. Trainable classifiers give you an alternative approach where you've got less predictable formats. So take something like an invoice. It's not necessarily going to be something that you can match very easily with sensitive information types or regular expressions. It can take a whole range of different formats. So trainable classifiers instead take a machine learning approach, and we can use these trainable classifiers with retention label policies, with sensitivity label policies, and with other things as well, such as communication compliance. And the way they work, it's really textbook machine learning. You start by giving it some C content. So you take somewhere between 50 and 500 examples of content that matches your classification. So let's say it's an invoice, you give it up to 500 invoices. That allows it to build a model. You're then going to test that model by giving it up to 10,000 samples. And some of those samples should be positive, so they should be invoices, and some should be negative, so they should be something else. You then review it. You basically see how it does, and you give it feedback on whether you agree with its classification, whether you disagree, or whether you're not sure. And that allows it to learn and refine that model. And then once you're happy with that process, you make it available. You make it available for use in compliance solutions, and you can use them to drive your automatic labeling. So enhancing discovery through reporting, you've got lots of tools in the Compliance Center that can give you insight into your content based on what labels have been applied. So if you've set up your manual, your automated labeling, they can really give you some useful insight into what's actually going on in your environment. So in this case, for example, I can drill down into a specific retention label, so employment records, and see exactly which SharePoint sites or which locations, which mailboxes that content is showing up on. So fortunately, in this case, it's a demo tenancy anyway, so there's not a huge amount going on, but everything's confined to one SharePoint site. So probably a key point there is that in addition to applying controls and applying restrictions, applying lifecycle management, these labels can give you real insight as well into what's going on in your environment. So for the last 5 minutes, just to wrap up, I wanted to take a quick look at some of the things you can do to proactively design your environment, your Microsoft 365 structures, to make these kind of information management approaches more effective. So the key thing here is that modern governance and compliance tools are designed to work with flat, granular structures. So focused teams, granular SharePoint sites with no subsites. And the reason for that is large and complex nested sites, the kind of thing you might see sort of in a classic SharePoint environment 5 or 10 years ago. They're not that predictable. So you can't look at these sites and say as a whole, does it have a consistent sensitivity label? You know, which bucket should it fall into? They don't have consistent security requirements. They don't have consistent lifecycle management requirements. They're just too big and unwieldy to classify and manage as a unit. So what does make a good site or team? Really, we look at 3 areas. So look at the membership. Do we have a clear and well-defined membership for the site? Does a single set of access controls work for the entire site or team? How long do you expect the site or team to last? Can we manage all of the information in our site and team in a consistent way for information lifecycle? And if the answer to all of these questions is yes, then the chances are you've got a good foundation for a site or team now. So when you're designing a SharePoint site structure, we'd encourage you to design around ownership and security. Keep your sites granular, so no subsites. And generally, the rule is if you've got a set of content that either has a different owner, so by owner we mean the person who's kind of got overall accountability for making sure it's up to date, accurate, not litigious, and so on. If you've got a set of content that has a different owner or a different set of users require access, then 9 times out of 10 it'll be better off in a separate site. So really aiming to model our sites around ownership and security. Very similar approach for teams and for collaboration spaces. So any collaboration space that builds on a Microsoft 365 group like Teams is built on top of a specific group of people, and it's designed to have monolithic permissions. So it's a security group. Basically, you're either in or you're out. There is no nuance. Everyone's an equal participant. So if you want to restrict access to parts of the team, open up parts of the team to a broader audience, or create tiered levels of access, then the chances are your team may be too broad. There is a slight caveat to this, which is private channels. Private channels do allow you to lock down part of a team. They're also a bit of a governance nightmare, but that's probably a conversation for another day. And the final thing is, within your SharePoint sites, use document libraries effectively. So every site you create can contain up to 2,000 document libraries. In reality, I'd be amazed if you have more than a dozen, but in theory, you can have 2,000. Multiple libraries are usually a better way of organizing information than the multiple nested folders. And the reason for that is each library can be configured differently. So we can set a different default retention label on each library. So for example, in a finance site, if you've got a library for invoices and you've got a library for accounts payable, whatever it might be, you can set different labels on both of those locations and have them managed accordingly. So we're designing our sites around security, but within those sites, we're designing our libraries for manageability and to organize our content intuitively. So if sites are your filing cabinet, you're controlling who's got the keys to the cabinet. Within that site, libraries are our dividers. Libraries are our way of organizing content at the top level. And that brings us to the 45-minute mark. So at that point, I will hand you over to Lisa for some questions.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, got a few questions coming in here. So I'm going to start with what would you recommend starting with first?
Okay, that's a good question. Personally, I think I would go with the container-based classification. So this is using sensitivity labels to classify SharePoint sites, classify teams, classify groups. Reason for that, it's very easy to set up. There's not a huge amount of admin overhead there. There's not a huge training requirement. It's easy to understand. Basically, you're just picking a level when you create your site and team. And it gives you that kind of perfect compromise between treating everything in your tenancy the same and micromanaging sites and teams. It's basically saying pick a level, choose the right sensitivity level, and we'll put those appropriate controls in place automatically. So that's usually a pretty good place to start.
Thank you. I've got another one here, which is touching on licensing. What licensing do I need for everything you've spoken about?
That's quite broad. As a general rule, most of the basic functionality, so creating labels, publishing labels, making them available, allowing people to set default labels, that's covered within your Microsoft 365 or Office 365 E3 or Business Premium licenses. The server-side automatic labeling and things like Trainable classifiers, that requires either E5 level licensing or some of the add-ons. So I think you can do it through a compliance E5 add-on, or there's another E5 add-on as well that the term eludes me, but our account managers are usually pretty good on this stuff. They will have the details to hand. I guess the other key one really is for group-based governance controls. So things like our group expiration policies, that requires an Azure AD P1 license. Now you get a P1 license with Business Premium. You get it with Microsoft 365 E3, but not with Office 365 E3. So it'll be an add-on for Office 365 E3.
Brilliant, thanks. I've got one here which says, do you have any advice on handling emails for consultancy work which is sensitive and needs to be retained? Do I get the consultants to label all emails in and out? How do I get back to the files of that project 10 years from now? Do I have to force them to add a project ID in every email?
The ideal way, I guess, would be to have a group mailbox and copy everything to that group mailbox. You can set default labels for specific employees on specific projects. Probably in terms of retention, the ideal would be if users create a subfolder and they have a default label on that subfolder. It's something you as admins can set up and just drag project information into that subfolder, and that will then apply any retention labels automatically. But copying a group mailbox is a really useful thing to do as well. So if you create a Microsoft 365 group, you've got a group mailbox, include that on all your correspondence or use rules to do that. You've then got a record of all that correspondence. That's obviously useful if people come into a project halfway through as well. Protection is slightly different because you're handling that through sensitivity labels rather than through retention labels. Again, if it's confidential, if it has specific handling requirements, then you want to publish sensitivity labels to those individuals that are working on those projects, train them on using those labels, possibly set up automatic or recommended labeling, but definitely train them on how to use those labels. And that's quite common for government projects where you're applying things like an official or an official sensitive designation to emails and handling them accordingly.
Cheers, Jason. I've got another one. How does records management differ from version history?
So version history in SharePoint and OneDrive is basically designed to be a recovery tool. So the idea is that if you've messed up your file, if you need to go back and restore a previous version or compare versions, version history allows you to do that. And it gives you an idea of who's done what and when. Version history can be deleted. It's not always configured. Libraries will be configured to retain variable numbers of versions, and users can delete versions as well. And generally, you want them to have the ability to delete versions if there's something litigious or in breach of a policy in a particular version. Records management is about the scenarios where you need to preserve a file or a specific version of a file for a specific length of time. So you're taking that version and you're basically locking it. You're saying nobody can change this version, nobody can touch it for whatever the period of time might be, with 3 years or 7 years. And then at the end of that period, you're either releasing the lock, you might be deleting it automatically, you might be retaining proof of deletion. So it's about basically making sure that your record keeping complies with regulations. Does that did that explain it?
I think so. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to pop them in. I've just had another one come through. I'll probably do one last question, but just for everyone's awareness, we will be sending these slides and recording through this afternoon. If we haven't managed to get through to your questions, feel free to reply and we can pass them on to Jason to get them answered. I'm going to end with one last one that's just come in. How do you recommend handling the initial business rules? Is there any general guidance to go from a keep everything scenario to correct retention and labeling?
It usually, in practice, starts with one team. So you're never going to do it right across the organization all in one go. So it usually starts with one specific requirement. And quite often it'll be something like cost assessments or risk assessments, where they know that they're obliged to keep those for a certain length of time. Once you've got that in place, you can start to spread the word and start to expand it to other areas of the business, start to show the benefits. The other area where it tends to come into play is HR. So if you're not storing content in a dedicated line of business system, if you do have HR content on SharePoint, HR teams will usually be very aware of their requirement to delete things after a specific length of time. So HR is usually another good early candidate as well for building those labels and putting those policies in place. And it's usually just a case of having those conversations with business leaders and stakeholders as well. It's a conversation I have an awful lot about why keeping everything forever, or it's not even necessarily keeping everything forever. If you have, say, a blanket global retention policy that keeps absolutely everything for 10 years. That's also a bad idea generally. It's not a nice way of managing content. So start with the early adopters, start with the people with kind of clearly identified needs, and grow it from there.
Brilliant, thank you. I've actually got one other that's a bit more general that might be good to end on, which is, are there any books about this topic you can recommend, or I guess any other resources?
Microsoft publish a whole bunch of resources on all of this area. So the key terms to search for would be Microsoft Information Governance and Microsoft Information Protection. So governance for the records management, the lifecycle management, and protection for the sensitivity labels, the AIP integration, and so on. There don't tend to be books on the technical side of things, which is obviously my angle on this, really because it moves so incredibly quickly. It's by the time you've got the book out, it'll be out of date. So Microsoft resources are a good place to start. The Microsoft blog posts are also a good area to start with. So most of them come through Tech Community, techcommunity.microsoft.com, and get those email summaries in from the relevant product groups at Microsoft, and you'll have early notice, early indication of what's coming down the line.
Brilliant, thanks Jason. I think we'll wrap it up there just because I'm conscious of time, but thank you everyone for attending, and you'll get the slides and recording this afternoon. Thanks Jason.
Thanks very much everyone.